Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Cedric J. Robinson's Black Marxism.
Oh yeah, Black Marxism.
It's a book that really pushes back against some of the traditional ways we think about Marxist theory, especially when we're trying to understand like the Black experience.
Yeah, for sure. I think Robinson's work really wants us to think outside of just that traditional European viewpoint
Yeah.
that we see in, typical Marxist analysis.
Okay, so you're saying there's like more to it than just workers versus owners.
Exactly. Like one of the big arguments that Robinson makes is that this whole idea of race, and especially the way that whiteness has become a thing, it goes back like way further than just capitalism.
Oh, wow.
He's saying that like racialization was already happening in Western civilization way before we had factories and wage labor and stuff.
Yeah.
So he's kind of challenging this idea that like racism is just a product of capitalism, right? Yeah, exactly. Like he points to these periods like the Dark Ages in Europe, which is a time that's often overlooked in, those classic Marxist analyses.
Mhm.
And he argues that even then you can see the beginnings of like racial thinking. He even looks at, how groups within Europe, like the Slavs or the Irish, were treated like almost like different races and faced prejudice.
Yeah.
It's all about how these concepts of blackness and whiteness were kind of built up over like centuries, tied into power and culture and even, religion.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never really thought about how the whole idea of whiteness even came to be. It's just always been there, right?
Right.
Like I'm starting to see how just focusing on economics and class might miss some really important pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's like one of the core arguments of Black Marxism.
Yeah.
He says that traditional Marxism, with its focus on those European industrial societies, has trouble explaining the unique horrors of like transatlantic slavery and its long-term effects.
Right.
He sees it as more than just like a stepping stone to capitalism. It's like actually a core part of, the modern world economy.
That's really fascinating to me, this idea that slavery wasn't just some like precursor to capitalism, but actually like built into its very DNA.
Exactly. And he points out that the brutal exploitation of black labor through slavery was like a major fuel for the expansion of capitalism for centuries.
Yeah.
This close connection between like racial exploitation and economic development is something that he feels traditional Marxists like don't really pay enough attention to.
Okay, so he's saying that we can't really separate the history of capitalism from the history of like racial oppression.
Exactly. And understanding that connection, according to Robinson, is like super important to understanding why black resistance movements throughout history have acted the way they did and what strategies they used.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, think about it. If traditional Marxism is saying that, like, workers of all races should unite based on their shared class interests, Robinson is adding this whole other layer of complexity to it, right?
Yeah.
He's saying that the historical experience of being racialized makes that unity much, much harder to achieve.
Right. And he's really challenging this assumption that class is the only thing that drives black radical thought.
Mm-hmm.
He emphasizes what he calls the black radical tradition, this like deep wellspring of resistance movements, philosophies, and cultural forms that have challenged power structures and fought for black liberation for centuries.
Okay, so if it's not just about economics, like what are some examples of those historical movements and philosophies that, make up this black radical tradition?
Well, he points to things like the Maroon communities in the Americas.
Okay.
These are communities formed by escaped slaves who like basically created their own societies,
Mm-hmm.
totally defying colonial powers.
Right.
And he also looks at slave revolts, arguing that they weren't just, spontaneous uprisings. They often reflected a really deep understanding of like the oppressive system they were fighting against.
Yeah, that makes me think about something I read about the Haitian Revolution, how it wasn't just like a few individuals rebelling, but it was like years of organized resistance and planning that led up to it.
Exactly. And Robinson stresses that these movements need to be understood in their own right, not just as like reactions to European colonialism.
Right.
He argues that black resistance has its own internal logic, its own motivations, its own goals, deeply rooted in the history and culture of African peoples.
So are we saying that like black radicalism is more than just a response to oppression? It has its own unique character, right?
Absolutely. To really get the black radical tradition, he argues that we need to like look beyond European-centered frameworks and explore the specific historical and cultural context where it emerged.
Yeah.
And that leads us to two interconnected areas of influence that he thinks are crucial: the Black Atlantic and the Black Mediterranean.
Okay, those sound really interesting. Where do we even begin with those?
Think about them as like these huge networks, right, of cultural exchange,
Yeah.
political exchange.
Okay.
So you've got the Black Atlantic encompassing all those trade routes, those cultural connections between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. And it was like this crucible,
Yeah.
where Black radical thought was like forged.
Hmm.
It's where African cultures mixed and mingled, creating new forms of uh, resistance and like a new political consciousness.
So are we saying it was more than just a place of exploitation? It sounds like it was like this source of like amazing cultural energy.
Exactly. It's not just about what was taken from Africa, but what enslaved Africans brought with them. Their traditions, their beliefs, their views of the world. And they combine that, right, with their experiences of oppression and resistance in the Americas. And that fusion created something completely new and really powerful.
I'm starting to see how this all links back to Robinson's critique of traditional Marxism. It's like acknowledging that we can't fully understand the Black experience through that European lens.
You're absolutely right. Now, the Black Mediterranean, you can think of it as like a precursor to the Black Atlantic, right?
Yeah.
And it encompasses all the historical and cultural connections between Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, going back even further to the period of Islamic expansion. And those connections through trade, cultural exchange, migration, they were fundamental in shaping both Europe and Black radical thought.
Wow, so Robinson's really changing how we look at history here. He's showing us how these regions, they're all connected. And those interactions over centuries shaped how Black radical thought developed.
Exactly. And within this like bigger historical framework, Robinson points to something that often gets overlooked, and that is the influence of Islamic intellectual traditions on Black radical thought. Think about the really complex ideas about philosophy, science, and politics that were circulating in Islamic societies. These had a huge impact on Black intellectuals, right? Giving them different ways to understand the world and challenge the dominance of European thought.
So it's not just European ideas shaping Black radicalism, but ideas from the Islamic world, too. That adds a whole new layer.
It does. Robinson gives us specific historical events and figures that show these interconnected spheres of influence. One powerful example is the Haitian Revolution.
I can see why he would focus on that. It was such a monumental event.
The Haitian Revolution, right. Enslaved Africans overthrowing colonial rule and establishing an independent Black nation. It sent shockwaves, not just throughout the Americas, but like the world. It became this symbol of Black liberation. But it also made slaveholding elites really nervous. They were worried about similar uprisings happening in other places.
So it wasn't just about Haiti itself, it was the message it sent to the whole world.
Exactly. And Robinson highlights a crucial connection. A lot of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution had experience with Maroon communities.
Oh, okay.
And they drew upon the tactics, the strategies, the ways of organizing that had been developed in those spaces of autonomous Black resistance. A powerful reminder that the Haitian Revolution didn't just come out of nowhere. It was built on a long history of Black struggle.
That's a good point. Understanding that historical context is key to understanding the impact.
Exactly. And to understand how these ideas evolved, right, over time, we have to explore the relationship between Black intellectuals and Western thought. It's complex. They were engaging with Western ideas, right, but also criticizing their limits and biases.
I thought that was a tricky balancing act. What are some examples of this engagement and critique that Robinson highlights?
He looks at figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright. These were thinkers who were really immersed in Western intellectual traditions. Philosophy, history, literature, political theory, you name it. They weren't just rejecting Western thought completely, but engaging with it critically.
So you're saying they used Western tools to, like, dismantle Western structures. That's pretty powerful.
That's a great way to put it. They adapted and transformed Western ideas to fit the specific historical and cultural context of Black radicalism. Take Du Bois' concept of double consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
It's this idea that Black people in America live with a dual identity. They see themselves through their own cultural lens, right?
Yeah.
But also through the lens of a society that devalues them.
I remember learning about double consciousness in college. It was a real eye-opener for me. It captures that feeling of being both inside and outside of society, you know?
Exactly. And Du Bois uses this concept to expose the deep racial divisions that fracture the idea of a unified American identity. Robinson argues that Du Bois' work shows how Black intellectuals have used Western concepts, like consciousness and identity, to illuminate those unique experiences and challenges faced by Black people.
It's like they were turning the tools of Western thought back on itself, right? To reveal its own contradictions.
Precisely. Now, let's talk about C.L.R. James, a brilliant historian, political theorist who was very influenced by Marxism. He saw the potential for Marxist analysis to explain colonialism and capitalism, but he also recognized its limitations.
So he was a Marxist, but also a critic of Marxism.
Yes, he saw both the strengths and weaknesses. A perfect example is his groundbreaking work on the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobin.
Oh, yeah.
James uses that Marxist framework to analyze the economic and political forces at play. But he goes beyond traditional Marxism by highlighting the independent agency of enslaved Africans in shaping events.
So while class struggle is important, there's more to the story.
Exactly. It's about understanding how those multiple factors, culture, race, historical context, all come together to shape Black radicalism. It's complex.
And that brings us back to the idea that slavery wasn't just a step on the way to capitalism, but a key part of it. James's work on the Haitian Revolution really reinforces this. It shows how enslaved Africans actively shaped history. They weren't just passive victims.
You've got it. And that brings us to Richard Wright.
Okay. What about his contributions to Black radical thought?
Wright was a novelist, essayist, really grappled with the effects of racial oppression in his work, explored how racism dehumanizes everyone, the oppressor and the oppressed. His novel, Native Son, is a powerful example.
I remember that book. It's a tough read, but so important. It's unflinching in how it portrays racism in America.
Exactly. And Robinson sees Wright's work as an example of how Black intellectuals have used literature to challenge those dominant narratives and give a voice to the marginalized. He argues Black radicalism has always been expressed in different forms, from political organizing to art.
I'm seeing how Black radical thought has always been about finding those creative ways to challenge the way things are, to fight for liberation.
Precisely. It's important to remember that these thinkers weren't just playing with abstract ideas. They were deeply involved in social movements, in political organizing, fighting for real change. But they didn't always agree on the best path to get there.
That makes sense. I'm sure there were lots of different perspectives and approaches within the Black radical tradition.
Absolutely. And Robinson points out that those internal debates and disagreements, they're actually a sign of the tradition's vitality. It shows it's a continuous process of grappling with complex issues and adapting to a changing world.
So it wasn't just one unified movement, but this dynamic, evolving tradition with internal disagreements and different schools of thought.
You got it. And Robinson argues that understanding this internal diversity is crucial to really understanding how rich and complex Black radical thought really is.
This deep dive has been really insightful. We've talked about the limits of traditional Marxism, racialization, the Black radical tradition, the Black Atlantic and Black Mediterranean, and the contributions of these key Black intellectuals. Is there anything else Robinson explores in Black Marxism?
To really understand how important his work is, we need to understand his critique of traditional Marxist theory and how, especially in its European forms, it often failed to understand and address the struggles faced by Black people.
Okay, I'm ready for that. What are some of the specific critiques that Robinson makes against European Marxism?
One of his main points is that European Marxism, with its focus on the industrial working class as the revolutionary force, often overlooks the historical and ongoing experiences of racial oppression that Black people have faced.
So you're saying there's a blind spot when it comes to race?
You could say that. He argues that even though it claims to be universal, European Marxism has often been limited by this Eurocentric viewpoint that prioritizes the experiences of European workers while pushing aside or overlooking the experiences of those outside of that framework.
And how does Robinson see this playing out in the history of, socialist and communist movements?
Well, he looks at how Black people have often been excluded or marginalized within these movements, even though they share those common economic interests with white workers. He says that European Marxism's failure to really confront the realities of racial oppression has prevented it from building truly inclusive and transformative movements.
It sounds like he's not just critiquing theory, but lived experiences.
Exactly. Robinson argues that to be truly revolutionary, Marxism has to grapple with the realities of racial oppression, both historically and in the present, and it needs to integrate those realities into its analysis and strategies for social change.
It seems obvious you can't just ignore a huge part of the population and expect to build a successful movement.
Precisely. And Robinson points out how black radicalism has offered this powerful critique of traditional Marxism, pushing it to move beyond those Eurocentric limitations and embrace a more inclusive understanding of class struggle.
Can you give me some examples of that critique? Like, how have black radicals challenged traditional Marxist thinking?
Robinson highlights the work of black intellectuals and activists who have argued that racial oppression isn't just a side effect of capitalism. It's this deeply embedded system of power that needs its own analysis and resistance. Thinkers like Du Bois, James, and Wright, but also activists like Marcus Garvey and Angela Davis.
So they're not just saying Marxism needs to pay more attention to race, they're saying it needs to fundamentally change how it thinks about power and oppression.
Right. Robinson argues that black radicalism offers this more nuanced understanding of how race, class, and other forms of oppression all work together, how they intersect and reinforce each other.
So instead of seeing race as less important than class, or as just a tool of exploitation, black radicals are saying it's a whole system of power in itself, with its own rules and dynamics.
That's exactly right. And to build movements for liberation, we need to understand this system of power. He believes black radicalism, with its deep historical roots and sophisticated analysis of racial oppression, has a lot to offer in this regard.
This is really making me think differently about race and class. So Robinson is basically saying that black radicalism provides this vital corrective to European Marxism. It forces Marxism to confront the realities of racial oppression and develop a more complete understanding of social change.
You're right on track with that. And he argues that this correction is crucial for building truly transformative movements that can dismantle all kinds of oppression and create a more just and equitable world.
It seems like Robinson's making a really strong case for the importance of black radical thought, not just to understand the black experience, but to develop a theory of social change that's more relevant, that can address the complexity of our world.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another key aspect of Robinson's analysis: his critique of nationalism as a force that has often held back the development of solidarity and collective action across racial lines.
Okay, that's interesting. It seems like, national liberation movements would be viewed positively in Marxist thought. So what's Robinson's take on nationalism?
While he recognizes that nationalism can mobilize people against, say, colonialism, he also argues that it's often used to divide working people, which makes it harder to create cross-racial solidarity.
So nationalism is kind of a double-edged sword.
Precisely. Robinson points out that nationalist sentiments have been manipulated to create divisions between black and white workers. That weakens their collective power and makes it harder to challenge systems of exploitation.
It sounds like the old divide and conquer tactic.
You're right. And Robinson argues that this strategy has been used throughout history to undermine movements of the working class.
So if nationalism can be so divisive, what's the alternative? How do we build solidarity across racial lines?
Robinson emphasizes developing a radical consciousness that goes beyond those narrow nationalist frameworks. A consciousness that recognizes the shared interests of working people across racial and national boundaries. He says that to build that kind of consciousness, we have to confront the ways in which racism and nationalism have been used to divide working class movements. And we need to actively build bridges of understanding.
So he's calling for a more internationalist perspective, one that puts the common good above, like national or racial loyalties.
Exactly. He believes this internationalist perspective is key to building effective movements that can challenge things like global capitalism and other systems of oppression.
It's true. Nationalist rhetoric is often used to justify inequality and exploitation, both within countries and between them. It's like we're constantly being told to prioritize our own national or racial group above the well-being of everyone.
That's a crucial point. And Robinson argues that black radicalism, with its emphasis on challenging all forms of oppression and building solidarity across racial and national lines, offers a powerful antidote to this divisive nationalist ideology.
Okay, so we have this tension, right? The need to address the specific oppression faced by black people, but also the need for solidarity with other oppressed groups, regardless of race or nationality. How does Robinson see those two goals working together?
Robinson believes that true liberation requires a multifaceted approach, one that acknowledges both the particular and the universal. So we address the specific historical and cultural experiences of different groups while also recognizing the common humanity that connects us all.
So it's about finding a balance between acknowledging our differences and seeing what we share as humans.
You got it. And Robinson sees Black radicalism as offering this kind of model, a nuanced and inclusive approach to social change.
I'm really starting to appreciate how deep Roberson's analysis is. He's not just critiquing traditional Marxism, but he's offering a way forward, drawing on the rich legacy of Black radical thought to, like, chart a path toward a more just and equitable world.
And to fully appreciate that legacy, Robinson really dives into the roots of Black radicalism, its historical and cultural roots. He traces its development from pre-colonial Africa through the transatlantic slave trade and right into the modern era.
That sounds like an incredible journey. What are some of the key historical moments and developments that he highlights in this exploration?
He starts by emphasizing how important it is to understand African societies before European colonization. He's challenging that Eurocentric narrative that says Africa had no history or culture before Europeans showed up.
So pushing back against that idea of Africa as this blank slate?
Precisely. Robinson argues that African societies had their own complex systems of governance, social organization, economic production, and cultural expression long before Europeans arrived.
It seems kind of obvious when you say it like that. You can't understand Black radicalism without understanding its roots in Africa.
Exactly. And he highlights how those pre-colonial African societies often emphasize things like communal values, collective decision-making, and resistance to hierarchies of power. He suggests that these values and traditions formed a basis for the development of Black radical thought in the face of, colonialism and slavery.
So it's not just about rejecting European ideas, it's also about drawing on African traditions and values to resist oppression and create a better future.
You're right. Robinson argues that Black radicalism has always been about both continuity and transformation, drawing on existing traditions while also adapting and innovating to meet new challenges.
I like that, continuity and transformation. It captures how dynamic this tradition is, its ability to evolve and adapt while staying connected to its core values.
And to understand that evolution, he takes us through the horrific experience of the transatlantic slave trade. He explores how enslaved Africans resisted their captors and held on to their cultural identities, even in those brutal conditions.
So even in that system of oppression, he's focusing on how they resisted.
Yeah. Robinson argues that resistance to slavery took a lot of forms, from those individual acts of defiance to organized revolts, to creating maroon communities, which we talked about earlier. He shows how maroon communities drew on African traditions to create their own autonomous spaces of freedom.
It's amazing, even in those conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to reclaim their agency and fight for their freedom.
It is. And Robinson argues that spirit of resistance was crucial in shaping Black radical thought. He says that the experiences of enslaved Africans, their struggle for survival, their determination to resist oppression, it all provided this wellspring of ideas and inspiration for later generations.
This is giving me a new understanding of the resilience and creativity of Black people in the face of such awful circumstances. So how does Robinson see this legacy of resistance playing out in the modern era?
Robinson argues that the Black radical tradition continued to evolve after slavery was abolished. It took on new forms, addressed new challenges. He highlights things like Black nationalist movements, Pan-Africanist thought, and the Black Power movement as examples of that evolution.
So he's drawing a line from those earlier forms of resistance, the maroon communities, the slave revolts, to those modern movements for Black liberation.
Yes. He sees these modern movements as building upon that legacy while also responding to the specific conditions of their time.
So recognizing both the historical connections and the contemporary innovations.
Exactly. Robinson emphasizes that Black radicalism isn't a fixed set of ideas. It's a dynamic, evolving tradition that continues to shape and be shaped by the fight for Black liberation.
This has been an incredible journey through history. It's like we're getting a glimpse into this long, complex story of Black resistance and its influence on the world we live in.
And to fully understand that history, Robinson argues that we need to look beyond those traditional European ways of thinking and embrace a more nuanced and inclusive perspective.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Robinson's critique of traditional Marxism, his analysis of nationalism, his exploration of the historical and cultural roots of Black radicalism, and his focus on the Black radical tradition. What else does Robinson offer in Black Marxism?
Robinson explores this complex interplay, between race, class, and capitalism. He argues that these forces are like deeply intertwined. You can't understand one without the others. He challenges the idea that racial oppression is just a side effect of capitalism. Instead, he suggests that it has its own logic, its own dynamics.
So he's saying race isn't just a tool of capitalist exploitation, but a system of power in itself.
You got it. Robinson argues that racial categories, those racial hierarchies, they were constructed over centuries to justify the exploitation and oppression of black people globally.
And how does he see this playing out in the development of capitalism?
He shows us how racialization has been used to divide working people. That weakens their collective power and makes exploitation easier. He argues that, historically, capitalism has benefited from those racial divisions. Pit workers against each other, prevent a unified class consciousness.
So racism is a tool that capitalism uses to stay in power.
That's part of it, but Robinson is careful not to just reduce racial oppression to economics. He says that racism has its own history, its own logic, and we can't fully understand it through an economic lens.
Okay, so while capitalism benefits from those racial divisions, racism is also about power, a system of power that dehumanizes and marginalizes black people.
That's a key point. Robinson argues that understanding this complex interplay between race, class, and capitalism is crucial for developing strategies for social change.
This is helping me see the nuances in his argument. So if we accept his critique, where do we go from there? What strategies does he suggest for addressing racial oppression, for building a more just world?
Robinson emphasizes the need to develop a radical consciousness that recognizes how different forms of oppression are connected. Racism, sexism, classism, imperialism. For him, true liberation means dismantling all of these systems, not just focusing on one.
It's about seeing that all these struggles are linked.
Exactly. Robinson sees black radicalism as a model for this kind of intersectional approach. Its long history of challenging multiple forms of oppression, building solidarity between different groups.
And what about the black radical tradition in today's struggles for social justice? How does he see that playing out?
Robinson believes that the black radical tradition still has so much to offer those fighting for social change. He points out how black activists and intellectuals have been on the front lines of movements for racial justice, economic equality, LGBTQ+ rights. They're drawing on that legacy of resistance and innovation.
It's about using those lessons from history to guide and inspire activism today.
Exactly. Robinson sees black radicalism as this living tradition, one that keeps evolving to face the challenges of a changing world. And understanding this tradition, engaging with it, it's crucial for building movements for change that can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. My understanding of black radical thought has completely changed. It's not just about the black experience. It's about understanding how power works, about oppression, about resistance all over the world.
I'm glad to hear that. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm reminded of one of Robinson's most powerful arguments. Black radicalism, by its very nature, challenges us to rethink our assumptions about history, about power, about the potential for change.
So what's the question you keep asking yourself after reading Black Marxism? What stays with you?
Given everything Robinson shows us about historical context, how can we understand how black radical thought is evolving in the 21st century? What are the new forms this tradition is taking?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and it's one that we should all be thinking about as we continue to engage with that legacy and work toward a more just and equitable world.
It really makes you think, After reading Black Marxism, I keep coming back to Robinson's analysis of how those black resistance movements have really shaped global power.
Yeah, you touched on that earlier, and I'm really interested to hear more about that part of his work. How does he change the way we understand black resistance on, a global scale?
Well, he argues that black resistance movements have had a much bigger impact on shaping world history than, traditional accounts often acknowledge. He sees these movements as this constant force pushing back against, systems of power, from those early colonial empires all the way to, modern capitalist systems.
So it's not just localized struggles, it's about movements that have had these ripple effects across the world.
Exactly. He points to how black resistance movements have actually, inspired other struggles for liberation. Think about the anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia, or those labor movements in Europe and the Americas. They all drew strength and inspiration from how Black people fought against oppression.
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution, for example, it must have been so inspiring for people fighting for freedom all over the world.
Absolutely. Robinson sees the Haitian Revolution as like this turning point in world history.
Hmm.
It showed everyone the power of collective resistance and inspired, so many revolutionaries that came after.
So instead of thinking about these movements as isolated or just reactions to something, Robinson puts them right at the center of this like global story of
You
resistance.
got it. He's saying that Black resistance movements have been this driving force in shaping like the world as we know it. They've challenged the powerful and pushed for a more just and fair world order.
This makes me think about how all these different struggles for liberation around the world are connected. It's like
Yeah.
Robinson is showing us this web of resistance that like links together movements across continents and time.
That's a great way to put it. He's emphasizing how these movements have learned from each other, they've shared strategies, and they've inspired each other. Like it's this shared legacy of resistance that goes beyond any one nation or culture.
That's a really powerful and optimistic way to look at history. So Robinson's saying that Black resistance movements haven't just shaped the lives of Black people. They've actually had this huge impact on the course of history for everyone.
Yes. And to understand the importance of Black radicalism, he says we have to understand this impact.
Okay, we've covered a lot in our deep dive into Black Marxism. The limits of traditional Marxist theory, the complex relationship between race, class, and capitalism, that rich history of the Black radical tradition, and the impact those Black resistance movements have had globally. What does Robinson want us to walk away with? What's the message he's trying to get across?
Robinson wants us to see that Black radicalism isn't just something from the past, it's a living tradition that still has so much to offer us today. Anyone who's fighting for a more just world can find value in it.
So it's not just an abstract theory, it's a way to understand the world and actually work for change.
Exactly. He's encouraging us to engage with this tradition, to learn from its history, to really grapple with its complexities,
Yeah.
and to use its legacy to help us build a better future.
This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like my understanding of Black radical thought has been totally transformed. It's not just about the Black experience. It gives us a way to understand power and oppression and resistance everywhere in the world.
I'm so glad to hear that. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Black Marxism, I keep thinking about one of his most important points. That Black radicalism really makes us rethink everything we thought we knew about history, about power, and about how change is possible.
So what's the one question you keep coming back to after reading Black Marxism? What's the thought that stays with you?
Considering all the historical context Robinson gives us, I wonder how we can understand how Black radical thought is changing and evolving now in the 21st century. What are the new forms of resistance we're seeing in response to racism and inequality and injustice?
That's a really powerful question, and it's something we should all be thinking about as we learn from this tradition and work toward a more just future for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Black Marxism. We hope this conversation will inspire you to keep exploring these ideas and to think about how the Black radical tradition can help us understand the world and make a difference.